keep it open. Please raise your hand, and Mr. Firestein, if you could call on.
Absolutely, Professor. Thank you. Any questions, comments? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that there was a problem with the Chinese currency with regards to trade, and I read somewhere about like price pegging and how that was coming under fire for criticism towards China. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on how that works a little more.
Yeah. And the latter part of your question after the currency is?
Price pegging, like how does that play into how they kind of got up on our currency?
Yeah, I think there are two different issues here. One is you mentioned the currency issue. And the basic complaint on the part of the United States for many years has been that China is artificially maintaining its currency at an undervalued level that makes it easier and more cost-effective to export and harder to export to the United States and harder for U.S. companies to gain a similar foothold in the Chinese market. It disadvantages the United States and advantages the Chinese producers, and that's how the argument goes. In the last several years, the reality is, and you can look at this empirically and see what the rates of exchange have been. The fact is there has been a significant appreciation of the Chinese currency, so that some of the advantage that the Chinese government or Chinese producers had from a currency standpoint has been neutralized, and some of the concerns that U.S. policymakers have articulated have been assuaged. And in fact, we've seen movement in the right direction. I think it's appreciated about 30% in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. And it's moving in the right direction, the currency of China, the renminbi. But there's still, according to some ways to go. But the other point that I would make is that the currency issue is not the sum total or the sum total of the origin of the substantial, in fact, enormous U.S. trade deficit with China. We import from China much more than we export to China. That's the deficit. And the currency is not the principal driver of that deficit. I've seen studies that would suggest that if the currency were at a perfect market-determined rate today, you'd still have hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade deficits with China that aren't really related to that. It would solve some of the problem, but not the majority of it. A lot of it is the differing labor costs. A lot of it is, in some cases, industrial policies, market access, IPR considerations, and other factors. So the currency issue is important, but it's also not the silver bullet to bring our trade books, if you will, into better balance. You asked about price pegging or price setting. I think the point to note about China is it is in many ways largely a market-driven economy, but it is not totally a market-driven economy. There are still vast swaths of the Chinese economy that are owned, in which the means of production, if you will, the capital, are owned by the state/party, or owned by the state and run ultimately by the Communist Party of China. And so you have a kind of hybrid economy in which the market determines prices for a vast swath of economic activity, but where there isn't a true market mechanism ultimately determining price clearing prices or market clearing prices for some sectors of the economy, particularly the heavy industrial strategic sectors, aeronautics, air, in many ways some respects telecommunications, the defense contracting sector, and many other areas of the Chinese economy are not at present open to the full forces of competition that other sectors of the Chinese economy are. And that's particularly true in the services area. So we talk about goods on the one hand and services on the other. One of the areas of relative comparative advantage for the United States as a 21st century knowledge economy, and it's not the only area, but one of the areas is, in a sense, the knowledge economy products, services, software, intellectual property in the form of Hollywood movies or Kid Rock, DVD, CDs, etc. By the way, I come to Kid Rock through country music, not so much through the other side, but I'm a big admirer of this great Michigan artist. But the fact is, in all of these areas, the United States has great advantages, comparative advantages from an economic and trade standpoint, but we don't generally have the full throttled access to the Chinese market that, in many cases, these comparable Chinese goods and services have to our market. So there's a bit of an unlevel playing field, and it goes to the issue of pricing, it goes to the issue of market access, and the bottom line is there's still a lot of work to do in order to level the playing field and create fair competition. And both Democrats and Republicans in this country have often said, look, you give the American people a fair shake and fair competition and a level playing field, and we'll compete and win against anybody in the world. But the problem right now vis-a-vis China is we don't have that kind of level playing field. So very good question, touches on some core issues, and I appreciate your raising that. Yes, ma'am.
My question would be, I guess, the U.S. is continuously crying foul as far as like how Chinese currency is set up and how, that they're like, depreciating their currency on purpose essentially. But that, I guess, it would help our trade balance a little bit. But shouldn't we kind of be careful what we ask for, because then it would cost even more to borrow from them, so it will make our debt even larger and grow quicker because then their money would be worth more.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Very good question. Let me make a few general points about it. You're right. Sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for, but I think there is a broad consensus in the United States, in Congress, in the executive branch, the president, secretaries of commerce, and USTR, and so on, all favor an approach whereby, for the most part, or virtually, the Chinese renminbi, the Chinese currency, is, in a sense, its value is dictated by the market. There's a general consensus that on the aggregate, on the whole, that would benefit U.S. producers and exporters, and that the benefits would outweigh the costs. But your point is nonetheless well taken. And let me segue into another point that you've touched on, which is very important. And that is the issue of Chinese holdings of U.S. government treasuries, U.S. debt. And there's a lot of talk about this from the standpoint of U.S. politics, and also from the standpoint of, if you will, American economic security. Now, let's put a few facts on the table, because I think there's a lot of misinformation about this issue, whereas at the same time there's a lot of concern and even alarm about the degree to which China, quote, holds our debt. So right now, and let me ask some of the students here, not the faculty but the students, about how much accumulated debt does the United States have right now? National debt. Throw out a figure.
$16.6 trillion.
$16.6 trillion. Absolutely right. So we're coming up now on $17 trillion of accumulated U.S. debt in the coming months by next year, if not earlier. Now, how much does China hold of that debt? Do you know that figure?
I think it's only like $1 trillion, and that's spread out over a lot of portfolios, treasury bonds, and other things.
Excellent, excellent. Absolutely right. China holds about $1 trillion of accumulated U.S. debt. Absolutely correct. So that's about 1/16 or 1/17 of all U.S. debt. Now, I often hear people saying, hey, the Chinese are holding all of our debt, or the great majority of it. What are we going to do about that? As the saying goes, how do you argue with your banker? When you disagree on certain issues and they're bankrolling you, how do you express disagreement independently of your indebtedness to that player? Well, the reality is China holds about 1/16, 1/17 of our debt. That's still a lot. That's more than any other single foreign nation. It is less by far than the American people who own U.S. debt, and it's less than all the other countries combined, etc. But it's a lot. And so there is a concern that the United States needs to reduce our reliance on debt generally, number one, that we've got to get our national finances in order, and that in particular we frankly ought to be relying a lot less on borrowing from China than we have historically, so as to give our nation a free hand to deal with China and not worry about the leverage that a certain level of indebtedness, our indebtedness to them, gives them over us. So it is a legitimate concern. You're very right to raise the issue. But I just wanted to put the facts on the table and say it's a problem. It's an issue to deal with, but it's also not as dramatic as it is sometimes misportrayed to be when folks talk about, quote, the Chinese holding all of our debt. I think the broader point that I would quickly make before going to other questions is that we in this country, I think really, and I think all of us, faculty, students, administrators, all of us, Americans, and those who are from other countries who are interested in what's happening in this country, we have to really recognize, and this is my view, and I think it's a view that's shared by quite a few others increasingly, that probably the greatest threat to U.S. national security is not China, it's not Russia, it's not any country. It's not any country. It's our inability to get our own nation's financial house in order. I would argue that that is the greatest threat to our national security today. And the way that plays out, if God forbid it should play out that we cannot get a handle on this, and I hope that that doesn't happen, I think all of us hope that, it's not a pretty picture for this country. And at the end of that story is an America that does not look like the America of today. So the issue of debt, which you rightly raised, is very important, not just in terms of China, but more broadly. And I encourage all of you, particularly the students, to be active in political discourse in this country, across the aisle, and play a role in helping us fix these, all of us as Americans, fix these problems. Yes, sir.
I'm in education, so my question to do with just what you said about the national security is about how the country pull itself together, become a self-leader, because people play a large role in the world. How you see education will play a role in this, to help people really transform their consciousness, to be able to think more globally. I mean, it's not as a country as a whole, but the individual. Because now internationalization is not just at a country level or the big international company. It's to do with every family, every individual, every student in college. How we are going to invest or change the educational system, even the philosophy, in order to really help our students grow and become a leader themselves and become more leaders as well.
Oh, it's a great question, and I absolutely agree with the premise of your question. Which is that education is very much at the heart of a nation's prosperity and a nation's success. And I think it's notable that President Obama, including in the State of the Union address, which is arguably the key presidential address of any given year, it's the one moment where the president addresses the joint houses of Congress and the American people as a whole and so on. He himself, President Obama himself, has flagged education in the U.S. China context as a critical area for us to improve on. He and others have cited the fact that in many ways, Chinese schools, by some measures of academic performance, are outperforming a lot of U.S. schools. And in math and reading and so on, science, of course. And these are critical skills for a country to build the foundation for its future prosperity. And the workforce, the kind of workforce that can deal with the challenges of the 21st century workplace, which is increasingly internationalized, global. Markets are increasingly global in nature. And the bottom line is, if we lose the education competition in this country, we're going to lose the economic competition. There is no way that you dissociate those two things from each other. I think one of the things that President Obama, for his part, has called for is a sharp uptick or increase in the number of U.S. college and graduate students that go to China to study. I think that's a very thoughtful and important point. There are far more Chinese students that study here in the United States than there are American students that go to China, as I once did, and perhaps some of you have or will, and I encourage you to study abroad. It's a very significant experience to have. The imbalance between Chinese here and Americans there is very stark. The president, I think, has rightly said we need to do better. And by the way, that's true for all countries. I'd like to see more and more U.S. students spending time overseas. I saw a sign downstairs in this building that said, did you know, it was in Spartan green and white, said, did you know that 1/4 of MSU students study overseas? And for my part, as someone engaged in international relations and foreign policy, I'd love to see that number go to 1/2 or 3/4 or even every student. Obviously, there are practical considerations, and not everyone necessarily has career aspirations that take them overseas. But the fact is, I think we ought to do more in terms of study abroad. And quite frankly, at a more basic level, I certainly would agree with the bipartisan analysis that is out there that says that we in this country have got to do a better job of educating our young people, and here I'm talking K through 12, and arming them with the skills they need to succeed in a 21st century office place. Because the skills you need today are not the same ones that you needed when I graduated some number of years ago. And there's much room for improvement. The president has said it. Republican candidates for president have said it. How we get there is a source of debate. But I would just conclude my brief comments on this by saying you're absolutely right. Education is critical. And I would say that getting to students earlier in their education, at the high school level, at the junior high school, or even in the elementary stages, to, in a sense, socialize students to the notion that we live in a big world and that America's competitiveness and success depends on our ability to understand the world around us, to speak languages, to deal with other nations respectfully and in culturally appropriate ways, and to help others understand our values in this country. So you're absolutely right. I think we could talk about that at length, but those are some of my initial thoughts about the central and critical importance of education in this equation. Yes, ma'am, and then we'll come over to you, sir. Yes, ma'am.
You have quite a big experience geopolitically with both Russia and China, and we've seen a shift with the Chinese leadership and Putin, which is president in Russia. How does that affect the relationship between China and Russia, and does that have an impact on the United States relationship?
Excellent question. Thanks for asking that. Are you studying Russia now, by the way? Great, great. Glad to have a Russia-related question that also ties in so nicely with China. Thank you. Russia is also a critical player in the world. It is, along with the United States, got the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet Earth. It's the only country that actually has the physical capability of not only destroying the United States, but destroying the Earth. And I'm not saying it will ever do that, but I'm saying it has that capability, which means it's a force to be reckoned with in the world. And for many other reasons, it is one of the world's largest economies. It's not at China's level, but it is one of the top 10. And geopolitically plays an enormously important role in the world. It's a member of the permanent, what they call the P5, the permanent members, 5 permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, and so on. Now, by the way, U.S.-Russia relations have in some ways deteriorated in significant ways in recent months, over the last year or so. We could talk about that. Maybe offline we can also talk about that. But you asked about the China angle here, so let me say a couple of things. Number one, historically, there has been a great deficit of trust, strategic mutual trust, between China and Russia for many decades now. Now, these were both communist nations. China remains, at least nominally, a communist nation. Russia is no longer a communist nation, but they come from similar socialist legacies. They were socialist brethren, if you will, and sistren, if that's the right word, for decades. But they also parted ways early on and have never really trusted each other at all. As a result of that and other factors, the two countries have never developed a very robust trading relationship, and in fact probably greatly underperform their potential in terms of the flow of goods and services back and forth, notwithstanding the fact that they share a long border, a very long land border, which in fact generated some skirmishes in years past, but now is basically a border of peace. But the fact is it's a very underwhelming trade relationship. Whereas the United States and China do about $500 billion in trade, 500 billion roughly, a year in two-way trade. The Chinese and Russians probably historically have done 20, 30, 40 billion, in that range. It's currently maybe around 30 or 40 billion. I don't have the exact figure at my fingertips. But I know that the projection is that China-Russia trade is going to increase to about 80 billion in the coming years, and it may reach 100 or 200 billion in the next foreseeable future, namely in the next 5-10 years. Now that would be an enormous change, and that would, I think, usher in a very different kind of period in relations between those two countries. One other very significant thing to point out, and in fact, let me make 2 points. China and Russia, despite a lot of distrust mutually, and despite a kind of underperforming economic and trade relationship, often see the world for slightly different reasons in very similar ways. And they also take issue with many things that the United States does. And they also, I might add, tend to be very similar in their critique of U.S. foreign policy and in their analysis of things that are happening in the world, whether those issues are Iran and its nuclear program and what the UN should or shouldn't do about that, whether the issue is Syria and what the UN should or the international community should or shouldn't do, and the list goes on. So there is kind of a very similar viewpoint derived from different sources in their own traditions that bring them to more or less the same place. The second point that I would make is that, interestingly enough, Xi Jinping, who is now the new leader of China, he is the General Secretary of the Communist Party. He was selected to serve in that capacity in November, as I mentioned, during the transition last November. He's also the chairman of the Central Military Commission in a party capacity presently, which means he's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of China. And in March, in not too many days, he will become the next president of China. With those 3 titles, he'll be the leader of China for the next 10 years. Now, his first visit overseas will be where? To Russia. And that's rather interesting. By the way, Hu Jintao's first visit overseas was also, 10 years ago, was also to Russia. But I think it's remarkable that Xi Jinping, whose daughter is reportedly studying at Harvard University, is choosing his first overseas visit to be to Russia. And I think that is not accidental. These things aren't generally accidental. They're a way of saying, hey, we value this relationship, the symbolism is important, and we, the Chinese leadership, are going to make a concerted effort to improve China-Russia relations as we go forward. And I expect we'll see that happen. So for those of you who are studying China-Russia relations, and I've studied U.S. China and U.S. Russia, but I haven't delved too deeply into Russia-China per se. For those of you who are studying that, if you will, third side of the triangle, if I could put it that way, this is going to be a very fascinating and significant time to do those studies. So thanks for raising that question. How are we doing on time?
We're at 4:45 right now.
Okay. Should we? Do we have time for one more question, or?
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions, absolutely.
Okay.
There is, I should announce, there is a reception across the hall immediately after this, so there'll be meets and so on there.
Great, and I'll be happy to talk more with all of you. Thank you. Right afterwards as well. So maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then and I'll keep my answers brief. And then yes, yes, sir.
Let me jump in and ask a question.
Yeah,
then.
and then we'll come over to you, sir.
In the Asian Study Center, because we are an all-Asia study center, we follow what's going on in the entire region. And with the emergence of a new power or increasing power within a country, relationships always have to be renegotiated. But one of the things that I think you alluded to towards the end of your talk, that I think is part of the more sort of generally, if I may say, gloomy nature of this, and hopefully things will take a turn for the happier, is relationships with neighboring countries. And the fact that the U.S. has also taken some positions in respect to some of these relationships. Can you talk a little bit more about where that is going and what the future is, and also give us, if you can, any happy news in that area?
Thanks so much for the great questions. With respect to the East Asian picture broadly and China's and U.S. relationships with other players in the region, I think the general point that I would make is that whereas in recent years, up to fairly recently, China has made a serious effort to cultivate strong relations with the ASEAN nations, to a degree, to greater or lesser degrees with Japan at times, and other players in the region, to say nothing of a strong desire to cultivate better relations with the U.S. itself, which China welcomes and has stated in writing it welcomes as an Asia-Pacific player. The fact is, in recent years, for a variety of reasons, China's relations with some of its neighbors have deteriorated. And one of the things that has driven that is, in some cases, conflicts or disputes with neighboring countries, including, in a sense, countries that share maritime borders, over the maritime issues in the South China Sea, and now even more recently the East China Sea. And so, China has its own claims about these waters in the South China Sea and East China Sea. Other countries such as Vietnam, Brunei, the Philippines, and others have different claims. And as a result of that, China has started to bump up against some of its neighbors in ways that are rather unpleasant, literally including but not limited to ships literally bumping up against each other in waters, sometimes by design, which is a kind of rough style of doing things that often rankles people's feathers. So there has been, I think from a Chinese vantage point, to a degree, a deterioration in the temperature or the tonality of its relations with its neighbors. And then add to that the U.S., quote, pivot to Asia. And quite frankly, there are many in China, scholars and some officials, that would say there is a sense of a kind of effort by the United States and our Asian allies, including the 5 U.S. Asia allies are Japan, Korea, Philippines, Australia, and Thailand. We also have a strategic partnership with Singapore, which is almost a quasi-ally. China's beginning to feel rather hemmed in. It has more territorial borders, that is, it borders more countries than any other country in the world. And it's surrounded on its coast by countries that are mostly or disproportionately U.S. allies,